The U.S. and Russia are engaging in talks over ending the Ukraine war. On Tuesday, representatives from the U.S., including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, met with Russian delegates in Saudi Arabia. President Trump has already talked with President Vladimir Putin over the phone and expressed a desire for peace. Will 2025 be the year that the war in Ukraine ends? We'll find out with the next guest, Matt Gertken, Chief Geopolitical Strategist at BCA Research. Welcome back to the show, Matt. Exciting times. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too, David. Thanks for having me back.
Let's just get right to it. So, as I alluded to in the opening, we could see an end to the Ukraine war this year. Perhaps not. What's your take? Is this the last year of the war?
Yeah, I think it probably is. It's obviously something that the negotiations could extend into the next year, but certainly the window of opportunity for Russia is very clear while President Trump is in power. So I think it probably will be this year.
Okay. Let's take a listen to what Secretary of Defense said on the 12th of February as part of the U.S.'s terms for a peace agreement. Ukraine should not become a NATO member, and that a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 border is unrealistic. Take a listen to this clip, and we'll respond together.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
What's your reaction to what he said so far?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, first of all, the NATO membership is key, and having the American as a formal matter of policy, and the Americans admit that Ukraine won't join NATO, is a major concession to Russia and should help to culminate in a ceasefire agreement. At the same time, saying that ceasefire will then it'll be a durable peace is very far-fetched. Because Russia won't return the territory. By referring to pre-2014 territory, that's an admission that Crimea is long gone. Well, everyone already knew that. The question is, what about the parts of Ukraine, the Donbass, and parts of the east and south that have been taken since 2022? That is now open to negotiation. And then finally, the point about having European forces in there as well as others to secure a peace, well, that would be problematic, even from the point of view of U.S. strategy thus far. The U.S. has not wanted to have a tripwire that would cause conflict with NATO if Russia were, continuing to struggle with Ukraine and then the NATO forces were placed in Ukraine. So I think there's a little bit of a hodgepodge going on there, but Minsk 3 is what he said they don't want, and that may be very well what they end up getting.
Okay, I want to show you my screen one more time now. This is from Reuters. President Trump's administration said on Tuesday it agreed to hold more talks with Russia on ending the war in Ukraine after an initial meeting that excluded Kiev. And I want to bring this point to your attention because up until now, the official policy of the U.S. has been to include Ukraine in the decision to end the war in Ukraine. And this meeting with Putin excluded Kiev completely. How is this a departure from prior policy, and what is Trump signaling with this?
Yeah, okay, so the key here is that the American people voted on November 5th, and they basically voted against inflation. Trump won the election as a result of that. And so when it comes to what kind of federal spending can be cut, where Americans really agree is on foreign aid, military and economic aid abroad. And so Ukraine is sort of the last one in, the first one out. They're on the chopping block. And that's going to be savings that the Trump administration will then use to help finance their tax cuts. So what the American voters are demanding is basically a reduction of support. Now that puts Ukraine in a very difficult position because they've barely been able to hold the line against Russia with, the U.S. support so far, over $100 billion in aid. Now that's going away. And the Americans have already given key points to Russia, again, admitting that Ukraine won't be able to join NATO. So the writing is on the wall that Ukraine is effectively being abandoned. The Europeans had the opportunity, the moment Trump was elected, to go to Russia and start to negotiate. But I think it's convenient for them that President Trump will be taking the blame for abandoning Ukraine, while they may also benefit from containing the war and concluding the war. And so I think that the unfortunate issue for Ukraine is simply that they're lacking that American support now, and that's what makes it very likely that we will get a ceasefire, because it'll simply be a ceasefire agreed along the current lines of control. There may be a small swap of territory for the piece that Ukraine invaded in Russia around Kursk, but that's not very large compared to the huge amount that Russia's taken, and Russia may not even fully reciprocate when that territory is swapped. So that's where we're at, and in order to get a different result, you'd have to have a different U.S. election result.
Okay, so when Trump came into office earlier last month, he signed a series of executive orders. I believe one of them included a pause on foreign aid. And I think this may include financial aid to Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. But now, earlier this week, Trump said that he's doubling down on aid to Ukraine. Can you just kind of walk us through this discrepancy? What's going on here?
Well, yeah, the key is if you're going to negotiate with Russia, I mean, theoretically, you wouldn't want to throw everything, give them all the concessions at the beginning, right? So if anything, you'd want to demonstrate that you're willing to continue fighting. And that's why it's a little surprising that Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, said what he said, because he gave big concessions at the beginning. But anyway, providing continued support militarily and financially for Ukraine is a stick that can be wielded against Russia in order to make sure that Russia does in fact come to the table. The risk for the Trump administration is that Russia sees that the Americans have no appetite to continue the war, that the Europeans really don't either, and therefore actually accelerates and expands the war, and that could lead to a humiliating Afghanistan-like debacle for Trump, and it would completely undo his policy. So basically, he does have to retain some leverage against Russia. Although, if you look at the 4 points that the two teams agreed on, Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia, what they're saying is not only do they plan to negotiate an end to the war, but they also want to engage in broader cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. And so those points signal that the Trump administration is going to provide pretty significant concessions.
To my understanding, the meeting with Putin was held without the presence of not just Zelensky, but also European allies. Why is Trump, quote unquote, turning his back on NATO allies, according to the press?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the policy here that, again, because of the election, the result is the U.S. needs to cut back on spending. Ukraine is one of the options. There's a foreign policy element, which is that Americans are demanding that more be spent at home or more be spent on them and less spent abroad. Also, the Trump ideology or the Trump movement has basically adopted a foreign policy of, I guess you could say, more realpolitik, willing to negotiate with Putin directly and have great power competition negotiated at a big table and dictate results to smaller powers. And that's the opposite of what the Biden administration was trying to do, which was a more idealist and international foreign policy based on self-determination and promoting democracy. So that's just the difference in ideology that we've seen in many cycles between Republicans and Democrats. But Trump is clearly pursuing this in an aggressive way. And, the fact that Ukraine is sort of left behind is, again, it's unfortunate for Ukraine, but there's not really much they can do about it. The key question here is will Europe be entirely excluded? And what was most interesting about the talks today in Saudi Arabia is that Marco Rubio said that Europe will be involved at some point because they have sanctions on Russia, which implies that sanction relief could in fact be on the table here. And that is a significant surprise, even for those who were fully expecting the Trump administration to move quickly in trying to conclude the war.
Do we know what was discussed between Putin and Trump? What ultimately is the agreement here? Is that available for the public right now as we speak on the?
No, not really. But what is clear is that both agreed to visit each other's countries eventually. So that's part of, as you can see, a broader détente or reduction of tensions. And then also they agreed to have this meeting quickly in Saudi Arabia. And then that meeting agreed to set up a high-level committee, basically on both sides, to negotiate a ceasefire. I think we should underscore here again the third point of the 4 points that Marco Rubio outlined is about broader economic and geopolitical cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. And what that underscores is something that you can see if you look at the confirmation testimony of all these people in Trump's cabinet, which is that they want to pivot to Asia and focus on China, and they view the reduction of the Ukraine war as a pathway to focusing more U.S. resources on countering China and forcing Europe to pay up and manage Eastern Europe. And that's a really interesting position because, first of all, it implies that later the Trump administration is going to bring more pressure to bear on China. But it also means that from the European point of view, there's a contradiction because if the U.S. is not willing to support partners like Ukraine, if it shows a lack of resolve or patience in the face of inflation or other negative consequences, then in fact that could embolden China vis-a-vis Taiwan or Vietnam or others who do not have mutual defense treaties with the United States. So that's the sort of dynamic that we see. But the point is that the Trump administration believes that they can conclude this rapidly and that there can be a broader détente between the U.S. and Russia and that it will all serve the purpose of countering China. And it's really a questionable foreign policy, but they're going to give it a try.
Well, this begs the question as to whether or not Trump's administration views Russia still as an adversary. I bring this up because earlier last week and this week, Trump announced a reduction, if not a pause, in aid to South Africa, partly because South Africa has been cozying up to the likes of other BRICS nations like Russia. They've been more than friendly with adversaries of the U.S., including Iran, by the way. So now Trump is doubling down on saying, hey, South Africans have to stop doing that or they're not getting any more aid. So who is Russia to Trump? Partner, ally, potentially adversary he has to deal with, just another country he has to exist with? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, David, and it's one that will be revealed over time with the administration. The key thing here is, okay, some would say President Trump is just a lackey of Russia. He's a Manchurian candidate, or he has or that he's, or that there's a Russian conspiracy. Now, remember, that was investigated very fully by Robert Mueller in the first term, and despite one of the largest investigations ever, they didn't come up with conclusive evidence of Trump being, a foreign agent, a Russian agent. But obviously, a lot of people still think that's the case. I think that's probably something we can set aside. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. What we do know is that the domestic or nationalist faction in the United States political party has some interests overlapping with Russia, not only on progressive issues, sort of right-wing traditionalism and anti-progressivism, but also specifically in that group in the U.S., the nationalist group was the one that wanted to limit some of the imperial adventures abroad, including commitments to places like Ukraine. And that's in Ukraine, therefore, sort of was where the rubber met the road. But I think what we should look at this as is, can you do a reverse Kissinger in strategy? Henry Kissinger went to China, befriended China, and sort of separated Russia and China, and it was a major move in U.S. strategy. What Trump apparently is trying to do is a reverse Kissinger where he befriends Russia and isolates China. And I think that's the logic here. I think that's the geopolitical logic. And whether Trump believes that or not, that's clearly the indication you get, again, from looking at his cabinet members and from the Republican Party foreign policy establishment. And so what I would say there is that it's going to be very difficult to do that because the U.S. and Russia do not have a lot to offer each other, which is the opposite of the case of the U.S. and China back in the 1970s. Whereas China and Russia today both have a shared strategic enemy, which is the United States, and Russia needs Chinese capital, and China needs Russian minerals and resources. So there's a lot of complementarity between Russia and China today that didn't exist in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And there's not very much U.S.-Russia complementarity that could build a strategic partnership in order to isolate China. And I don't think that's really what Putin wants, even if he's willing to allow Trump to believe that it could work.
Go here. America has just tried to grab Ukraine's vast mineral wealth. This is from the Economist. So at this last weekend's Munich Security Conference, Zelensky met with Scott Bessent, apparently. And according to this article, the proposal demanded his country's mineral wealth in its entirety. Mr. Zelensky had an hour to agree, according to three sources with knowledge of the exchange. Unaccustomed to such blunt treatment, the Ukrainian president declined and pushed the discussion to the Munich conference. There, the Americans pressed once more, demanding Ukraine pledge $500 billion worth of natural resources as a back payment for military and aid supposedly already delivered. Okay, so what is Scott Bessent and his administration trying to do here?
Yeah, what they're doing is because they're unilaterally negotiating a ceasefire with Russia and effectively trying to impose that on Ukraine, but they're also demanding that Ukraine pay back for the over $100 billion in American aid that's been given. Now, from Ukraine's point of view, obviously there is a need to continue to appease and befriend the United States, right? They can't afford to be written out of their own future, so they need to keep vying to get at the negotiating table. But given the reality that they're probably going to be excluded, then they need to make sure that they don't make an enemy of the United States and be thrown completely aside and allow Russia to trample on them. And so from that perspective, Zelensky probably will offer some resource deals or opportunities to the Americans. But remember that this won't really be secure. You know, if you're a private company who wants to go in and develop resources in Ukraine, there's a few things to consider. First of all, Russia will want to be part of any new developments. And that could be for their own interest or also to sabotage anything. Now, if the Americans exclude Russia, then those in Russia, the negotiators, are going to be thinking, well, we didn't conquer Ukraine in order to give all the minerals to the Americans. Now, if Russians are included, that sort of poisons the well because then they can interfere with the development process, or they can try to benefit Russian companies. On the other hand, if Russia's excluded and Western companies try to go in and develop this, well, then the problem is that Russia will be trying to sabotage and undermine the process, whether it's at the mineral side or of the export side. And that means that the risk premium on those investments would be quite high. So what Trump needs to do is effectively negotiate a ceasefire, or, and eventually get buy-in from Ukraine and the Europeans. And he needs to make sure that the terms are such that Ukraine has a viable economic future of its own. And that would require allowing mineral resource to be sold on the market to Europeans and Americans and anyone willing. And that would also require the Russians not to blockade Ukrainian ports, and it would require the Russians to not interfere with the development of resources. And if Trump can get those terms from Putin, then that would probably be a win for his foreign policy.
What is the European allies' response to what just happened, which is the exclusion of the rest of NATO in Trump's discussion with Putin? Now, on the one hand, like you said, Ukraine can't afford to make an enemy of the U.S., but let's hypothetically assume or suppose that the U.S. were to abandon Ukraine completely. Do you think European allies would pick up the slack?
Not really. The sad fact is that no one, all along, from the very beginning of the war, no one has been willing to put their own boys on the line, to put their own children in harm's way. Sending young men to go and fight for Ukrainians. President Biden ruled that out before Putin even invaded, and you saw this also with the Western countries, where for example, Emmanuel Macron suggested putting French troops in, and it really went over like a lead balloon. The UK, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, said that British troops could go in, but he said only if they're backstopped by Americans. Sweden has also volunteered, but the key point there is backstopped by the Americans. Now, the Americans have not been wanting to put troops on the ground and have not wanted a tripwire where a Western or NATO force is in harm's way, and then that causes Russia and NATO to end up in a direct confrontation. So that's the sad fact for Ukraine, is that no one really wants to have their troops put in there as a tripwire. If the result is different, like look at what Hegseth said at the beginning of our talk today. If somehow European NATO forces, let's say NATO forces, are placed in Ukraine as a result of this negotiation, well then that's a win for the West. It provides some security guarantee for Ukraine, theoretically. But it's a big loss for Russia, and I don't see Russia accepting that. First of all, they've already rejected that. But second of all, if they went forward with it, it would mean bringing the very thing that Putin never wanted to have happen, which was that Ukraine had a reliable security guarantee from NATO. So basically, I don't think it's going to happen. If there ever are token Western troops in there, I'll bet they won't be NATO. And if they are NATO, then that would be a surprise to me.
Well, it doesn't have to be in the form of troops on the ground, Matt. Maybe the rest of the European NATO members could just contribute financially or
Exactly.
humanitarian
But
aid,
but
financial aid, military aid. Yeah.
But to be clear though, David, then that means it's not a security guarantee, right? As long as they're just that's the current status quo where the West is willing to provide some aid, and I think Europe would be willing to help rebuild Ukraine, especially if they can be given guarantees to be able to export their production. But that's not a security guarantee. That doesn't prevent Russia from taking further military action later. And the reality, I'm telling you, is that there really won't be a security guarantee. That was attempted back in 1994, and what we've seen over the intervening, 30 years is that those security guarantees are not very reliable in the case of Ukraine.
Let's go back to the discussion between Trump and Putin. What do you think is going to be the outcome of this negotiation? Again, it's ongoing. We don't know yet, but what do you think is going to be the outcome? On the one hand, what does Putin want? And on the other hand, what is Trump's red line here?
Yeah. Well, what Putin wants is to keep the territory he's taken and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO or the EU. And he's pretty close to achieving those objectives because the United States is tired of the war and willing to agree with him. Now, the problem he faces is that the U.S. is topsy-turvy. In 2029, we could have a different administration that could pursue a totally different policy. So that means he wants those outcomes from Trump, but he wants them to be locked in a way that doesn't prevent future action. And so again, he's going to reject a peace treaty where he gives back territory. He's going to reject a peace deal that's enforced by NATO or that provides those security guarantees we talked about. He doesn't want any of that to happen. And he also wants to retain control over Ukraine's economic future as a source of manipulation. And that goes to the Black Sea and the question of whether they'll be able to export goods reliably. And I'm not sure. I think Trump's going to have to do a very good job negotiating if he's going to get Putin to back down on that front.
Yeah.
The Americans basically want to cut their losses, but the Americans are not abandoning Europe or NATO. That has not happened yet. Some of the commentary is leaping to conclusions. Remember that Ukraine was not in NATO. They weren't a U.S. defense ally. So while it is, it is backtracking for the Americans to reduce support for Ukraine, it does not entail that the U.S. no longer supports or provides a security blanket for Europe or NATO. And the reality is that if that happens, that would be a massive global shock. That would stem from President Trump backing away from NATO, which in the past he has contemplated. But the U.S. security establishment and the policymakers behind him are very unlikely to let him do that. If he does that, he's effectively going rogue. And we could see all kinds of craziness to try to get him to change his position in the United States.
Okay, so we talked about why Trump isn't doubling down on providing aid or more aid to Ukraine, which is, you talked about this earlier, the American people want less inflation, not more, and they want cuts to spending on certain things. What happens then going forward? So the next step in this saga, has Trump admitted defeat by talking to Putin directly?
I mean, not for Trump, no, because what he has argued, well, first of all, the invasion didn't happen under his term, so that gives him the ability to argue that it wouldn't have happened, which is probably a specious argument, but nevertheless, it's plausible. Basically what he gets to say is he ran on the notion that the U.S. would conclude conflicts and promote peace and prosperity. So if he's cutting taxes and facilitating a ceasefire agreement, then he's fulfilling his agenda, and he will get support in the U.S. for that. His approval rating will go up, not down, if we end up with a ceasefire being signed in Ukraine. Most of the stuff we're talking about that are the negatives, those come later. And they could come in his term later, but probably not, because, again, Russia has a huge incentive to embrace this olive branch because if they don't, then both of the American political parties will be unified against Russia, and they would have the ability to redouble their efforts along with Europe in supporting Ukraine, which is detrimental to Russia. So I think from that point of view, if this ceasefire develops, then that's exactly what Trump has promised.
How do you think China is interpreting this development, negotiating with Putin? What do you think is on Xi Jinping's mind right now?
Well, I think the main signal here is that the Western democracies, and particularly the United States, do not have a lot of appetite for drawn out conflicts. I think that's the lesson that China's taking from this. They saw that, inflation went up and even though the US had decent real GDP growth, income growth and wage growth were in real terms were negative because of inflation. And that caused a change of party and that caused a change in foreign policy. And lo and behold, Ukraine doesn't have any support anymore. So, from China's point of view, this is emboldening. This is a signal that the U.S. really is, not going to be very reliable. And it means that if they take a long-term approach to Taiwan, they can eventually get their way in Taiwan. That's the sort of implication. They know that Taiwan is very different from Ukraine. They know that the Americans are more committed to Taiwan than they are to Ukraine, but they also believe that Americans are not very committed. And that's especially the case, remember, when we're talking about countries that don't have a mutual defense treaty with the United States, countries or states or whatever you want to call them. So the bottom line here is that I think China will be emboldened, and it doesn't mean that they're going to invade Taiwan tomorrow. That's not the implication. But the implication is that they think that their strategy will eventually work to intimidate Taiwanese, deter the United States, and over time just gain gradual control over Taiwan. And ultimately, if they're forced to take military action in their minds, they think that they'll be able to defeat the U.S. by imposing economic pain and by being willing to wage a longer war of attrition.
Well, that's an interesting scenario here. Let's just play this out and then we can end the discussion here, Matt. Suppose Trump or any other sitting U.S. president were to negotiate with Xi Jinping and his party on the issue of reunification. Obviously, we know China wants Taiwan. What do you think the U.S. terms would be in this negotiation?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think, to be honest, I don't think that's going to happen. I think I alluded earlier to the fact that Taiwan is more important to U.S. strategy than Ukraine. And I think that's an important difference that is liable to get caught up. So there is an analogy between Ukraine and Taiwan, but also it's a limited analogy. And specifically, what we've seen in our time recently is that semiconductors have really been at the forefront of this because the U.S. economy depends very significantly on electronic components, microelectronics, and semiconductors, and the most advanced ones are made in Taiwan. But remember that this is a lot deeper than that. It has to do with the U.S. position in the aftermath of World War II, which the U.S. fought long and hard to obtain. And so, from America's point of view, the entire security architecture in Asia Pacific would be in jeopardy if China could just change Taiwan's status at will and through force. And so the U.S. is very likely to continue to support Taiwan. And in fact, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said in his confirmation hearing that he wants to clear the backlog of arms sales to Taiwan. 24 billion in arms sales that haven't been fulfilled. He wants to get moving through those. And the National Security Advisor has a similar view, and certainly the Secretary of State does. So, in other words, this is an administration that's wanting to double down on Taiwan support. And in fact, they are even telling Europe to invest more in NATO. And what they're saying is increase deterrence, but they're saying at the cost of Ukraine. Now, if that is the final message and policy of the administration, then it is not necessarily an incorrect policy, meaning if the U.S. determines that Ukraine is a bridge too far and reduces support, but simultaneously bulks up NATO to deter Russia and all other territories in the future, and bulks up deterrence for Taiwan, then that would be a very muscular U.S. foreign policy. The risk with Taiwan is, of course, I would just give you two. One is too much deterrence, effectively provoking China. That's what happened with Ukraine back in 2022. Or if Trump tries to do a deal like you're saying, China could believe that that it's the only chance that they're going to get, and that means they would have to negotiate. And if the negotiation failed, well, then they might think that military option is superior as long as Trump is in office. So, long story short, I think Trump is going to be getting he's going to be trying to get a phase 2 trade deal with China. I think even that will be quite limited in its extent. And I don't think it'll involve a new strategic agreement over Taiwan other than a reaffirmation of the status quo. That's the best outcome that any of us can hope for in this administration is a phase 2 trade deal and a status quo agreement on Taiwan.
All right. I'd like to chat with you more about China and Taiwan in another episode because there's lots to discuss there. We can also talk about the containment strategy for the U.S. on China as they're expanding their military presence in the South China Sea, not just around the Taiwan Strait. But great chatting with you, Matt. Where can we find out more about your work, learn from you, read your work?
Thank you. BCA Research, Geopolitical Strategy. We're doing this kind of stuff all the time, updating with new events, and happy to have readers and people like you, David, who are interested in our work.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll put the link down below, so make sure to follow Matt and the BCA Research team there. Cheers, Matt. We'll speak again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.